You are listening to Method's Build What's Next Digital Product Perspectives, presented by Global Logic. At Method, we aim to bridge the gap between technology and humanity for a more seamless digital future. Join us as we uncover insights, best practices, and cutting-edge technologies with top industry leaders that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another podcast of Build What's Next. I'm Jason Rome, your host. I'm the head of solutions here at Method. I am joined by another Charlotte local here, Joe Fuqua. So, Joe, really excited to have you here today.
Good to be.
Would love for you to give a little bit of a background on who you are, and then I'll jump into what we're going to talk about today.
Sounds great. Yeah, real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So just a bit about me. I've spent the last 30 years of my career working in technology across a variety of industries. I got my start back in the late 80s, actually, at Oak Ridge National Lab, building, at the time, something that people really weren't involved a whole lot with, neural networks. Obviously getting a lot more focus and press right now. But back in the day, we were just trying to understand what they were capable of. So it was a really exciting time to be working in that field. But after that, I transitioned into more of a business focus and spent some time in telecom, again, in technology and data and analytics. And then for the last 20 years or so, I've been working in financial services across a variety of institutions, again, primarily in the data and analytics space.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about your role and your mandate now, if you will.
Yep, sure. So I joined Truist. It's been very exciting. I joined with them to help drive their enterprise data architecture, their future state architecture for the bank, which has been a lot of fun. And then most recently, I've been heavily involved with our overall cloud architecture and cloud security focus for the last couple of months. So a bit of a fairly broad mandate, if you will, but it's been a lot of fun.
And fun fact, Joe was also a radio DJ in Kentucky, and so I might ask you to do your sign off if you still got it later.
Previous life, yeah. We'll see if I can pull it off.
All right, we'll see. We'll have you do the ad read today as well.
Sounds good.
So being at Truist, and for those listening that aren't familiar with Truist, I think interesting time to be there, right? Recent giant merger,
yes.
Probably one of the biggest bank mergers of the last 10 years.
That's right.
Pretty easily. COVID.
Yes.
And then you mentioned neural networks back in the 80s. For those who didn't know, yes, neural networks might be older than you, but a lot of intersecting forces right now, potentially impacting Truist. And so, curious with the latest kind of wave and interest in AI that we're seeing, a lot of articles, you can't open up anything without hearing what some of the banks are deploying in the AI space.
That's
right now. How is that changing your role and the role of AI? I mean, the data team, the cloud team, the architecture team, and what I guess maybe what tables are there a seat at for those teams that there didn't used to be, and
sure.
and how is the business having to adjust to being able to think for like a data first, a cloud first strategy? I'd love to just hear how that's going, how you're handling that, what you're seeing in the industry.
It's a great question. I think we've seen so much change, certainly over the course of my career in terms of technology and its relevance to the business. I think when I first started my career, like I said, back in the late 80s, early 90s, technology really was seen very much solely as a tool, right? To sort of, not even really an enabler necessarily, but just something necessary to be able to run the business, right? To do accounting and things like that. Certainly over the last 10 years, we've seen more focus on technology and specifically like data and leveraging data in running the business. But I'd say it's been a bit of an uphill battle in terms of helping our counterparts on the business side understand what the value of their data is, how to leverage it, how to manage it. And certainly in the last, 3 to 4 years, as AI has really driven, I think, the broader consciousness, if you will, of what technology can do into the public domain. There's been so much talk about, what it is and how to use it. I'm seeing a lot more interest in the business and trying to understand how they can leverage certainly the newer technologies to make a difference in terms of how they're running the business. And we as technologists, I think, are beginning to be able to leverage that sort of interest in the hype into having deeper conversations about what I consider to be the more important conversation, and maybe less interesting, less sexy, but like, how do you manage your data, right? How do you govern your data? we're beginning to be able to have those conversations in a more structured way with the business and in a way that gets their attention where maybe before we were struggling with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because, the last, 10, 15 years of banking, right? So much of a focus on digital. Obviously as a digital product consulting company, we participated in a lot of that work, but it felt like such an arms race to get digital capabilities out there, self-service capabilities, mobile capabilities, add on to that all of the M&A that a lot of these banks have done and kind of systems that, were somewhat integrated or not fully integrated. Talk to a lot of banks that have, 3 or 4 deposit scores that they're trying to bring together. And so, digital was often the hero and data kind of got drug along for the ride a lot of times, both on the operational and the analytical side of just being able to kind of measure things and understand that ecosystem. So it is interesting seeing this AI kind of hype cycle and like the importance of data hit at the same time as organizations are trying to dig out of a lot of technical debt and kind of understand those two things. I guess, a lot to explore here. On that side, you mentioned trying to modernize like cloud architecture, system architecture, future state architecture. Like, how are you balancing just those and managing the trade-offs between, hey, we need to get the foundation right, we need to get some of this legacy technology to our new standards, while, hey, we're also trying to drive new business value and kind of meet those new needs, because those things both have to go through the same team.
That's right.
And so be curious how you guys are handling that and how you're thinking about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is a tension, right? Certainly, if you think about technology debt that we've acquired over the decades, we certainly do have a need to modernize our infrastructure and our technology. We do have to balance that against making investments to improve our ability to serve our customers from an experiential standpoint, right? All the things that you said. So the challenge for us is figuring out what the right line to walk there is. I'd say that maybe the conversation has gotten a little more straightforward in the last few years as cloud has become a more acceptable path to modernization. And as we as an industry have come to understand sort of what that means in terms of how you walk that path from purely on-prem to more of a cloud, I'll call it cloud right focus for infrastructure, that conversation has gotten a little bit easier, but we still have to make trade-offs about what we solve for now, like just getting onto the cloud, right? And realizing some of the advantages of being in an environment that allows us to focus on, core competencies versus just, day-to-day, maintenance and other related things, right? Figuring out what that right balance is definitely a challenge. But again, I think that the conversation has become somewhat more straightforward with the business in terms of making trade-offs. When do we make investments in a strategic investment in technology and infrastructure that maybe takes away for a period of time in terms of investments we're making to improve customer experience, knowing that there's a payoff down the road, right? We can have those conversations in a much more, I think, structured fashion now than maybe we could before. Before it was like, look, we have to do this because we're at an end of life on a particular technology, and the business didn't really care about that. But if we make this investment now and moving, as part of our customer infrastructure to the cloud, we'll be able to enable all these other features much more simply, right? And provide much better customer service. There's more openness to that conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because, a lot of the work we do is with product teams as well and working with technology teams. And for so long, the life of a product manager was a never ending set of new features and new things. And it was, our prioritization methods are all about adding things. They're not about taking things away. Right. They're not about fixing things that are broken. And so I've seen a real struggle of teams of like being able to, acquire this skill set that is more of the modernization versus the transformation skill set. Because it's just not something that a lot of people have had chances to practice on.
That's right.
And if you have never done that before, it's a very complex pattern of working with a data team, a cloud team, an architecture team that's, modernizing their service layer. Maybe you've got a team that's modernizing your application layer while you're trying to add new features, and figuring out who goes first is really tough. You mentioned, conversations gotten better. You've gotten the business to the table. I know you're passionate about responsible AI as well. And I guess, with kind of some of those constraints, as well as, legal risk and compliance obviously has a pretty big seat at the table with AI right now, especially Gen AI. As you look at, customer facing use cases versus maybe use cases for your, kind of frontline mid office, your bankers, your call center support folks versus your back office kind of administration and just running where has there been interest versus where are you finding traction
Mhm.
right now for AI use cases as you've started partnering with the business and making these trade-off decisions?
It's interesting, the dichotomy. There's a huge amount of interest and desire to leverage AI and really just technology in general, right, to drive better service to our customers within the business. But there's also an equal amount, and maybe in some ways, maybe more daunting level of fear, right, about what it is and what it can and can't do and what the potential risks are. And so a lot of the conversations we have are really that sort of like balance of how do we proceed with this, exploring this new capability and taking advantage of all the things that we're seeing, right? And not falling behind, right? We want to try to stay at least abreast or a good close follower with advances in technology without taking on too much additional risk. Because
Yeah.
as you know, in financial services, we have to be risk conscious, right? I won't say completely risk averse, obviously, because we have to be willing to take risks to make money, right? To be
Yeah.
successful and to penetrate new markets and acquire new customers and all the things we have to do. But we have to take those risks responsibly. Hence my interest in responsible AI, right? We have to come at this conversation in a way that allows us to manage the risks that we're taking on, right? In a way that doesn't jeopardize all the things we have to make sure that we don't
Yeah.
jeopardize.
Unpack that word responsible, because there's a lot of aspects of
That's
that
right.
when we're prioritizing use cases.
Yeah.
There's the ethical side, there's the regulatory compliance side,
Yeah.
there's
Environmental.
the black box
Sure.
of AI and kind of understandable and
Yep.
verifiable AI. Like
Yep.
when you think of responsible right
Yep.
now, and I guess also when banks think of the word responsible, like what aspects are they really focused on? What are other aspects maybe they should be focused on?
Yeah, it's multifaceted, right? And I think before, like you look at pure analytics, responsibility primarily was ensuring lack of bias, right? That your models performed equally well for all, tranches or whatever, all segments of the market you're addressing, that you weren't unfairly treating individuals or segments of the population, right? In ways that were negative.
Which is also highly, highly regulated
And
as well.
certainly
So
the regulatory
yeah.
requirements are there as well. And but, it's interesting, not to take too much of a detour, but for the way we look at things is we certainly absolutely are 100% focused on being regulatorily compliant, but our focus is on doing the right thing. And for us, then the regulation, right, the compliance with regulatory requirements sort of follows that,
Yeah.
right? If we're doing the right things and we're doing it the right way, we're going to be compliant. We make sure of that, but that's our focus, right? Let's do the right thing for the customer, for the business,
That's great.
and make sure that we're ticked and tied on the other things. But in terms of what that means from an AI standpoint, there certainly is that, right? There's making sure that the models are fair, and we can talk a lot about what that means. How do you measure fairness of a model? But there are other aspects, ethical aspects, that we have to take into consideration. So, and that can be driven by lots of different factors, right? So it's not just about ensuring that the models are giving consistent answers across the board, but how do you understand what the models are producing and how, right? So that you mentioned transparency, and that's a major focus, is understanding how the models are making their decisions, or at least as much as we can, understanding how those models are working. Because as you know, especially with generative AI, really kind of getting into the getting under the covers, getting into the guts of how those models work can be really tricky, right? So, but trying to bring some transparency to how those models work, but that has to be balanced against bringing too much transparency. As an example, if let's say you have a credit decisioning model, if there's too much transparency in terms of how that model is making the decision, that makes it easier for someone to game the model, right? So you have to be thoughtful about how much of that logic or how much of that process you're exposing, right? It needs to be just enough to make sure that it's behaving properly, that you can, measure the bias and reduce the bias, but not so much that people can necessarily, like bad actors, let's say, right, can abuse
Yeah.
the model.
Yeah, it's such a complex domain. I was having a conversation similar, not credit decisioning, but, setting interest rates.
Yeah.
And kind of, a lot of banks obviously very focused on deposits and deposits retention right now. And, there's so many different factors there. There's like, what's right for our balance sheet? What's right for this customer's relationship? What's right and fair from a compliance perspective? What is the right thing for the customer? And I gave the example, this past 2 weeks, right? Robinhood, I use them for some stuff, and I'm a gold member, and they sent me an extremely targeted offering. They're like, hey, the Fed's dropping rates. If you want to maintain your APY, deposit exactly this amount of money. And as I look at that as a technologist, I'm like, is that for everybody? Like, is my amount based on something they know about me? Is my timing based on something they know about me? And obviously, like, fintechs operate in different in similar ways, and they take different types of risks. But
That's right.
it's really interesting to like look at that one offer,
Right.
of like, all right, how did they get to this decision on like what they're trying to accomplish as a company? And there's just so much nuance. And so when you say transparency as well, how has that changed the relationship maybe between a data scientist and the business in terms of them being able to have a conversation and unpack a model? How have you seen that evolve?
Yeah, like I said, I think the conversations are getting maybe a little more, I won't say simple, but they're getting a little bit more straightforward. I'll say it that way. And what I mean by that is that before, trying to explain that to maybe a business person wasn't super easy, right? Because you have to get into sort of the complexities of how the models are making decisions and what we're driving toward. But I think as we've become more comfortable with, I won't call it automated, but technology-enabled decisions, the business is becoming more comfortable with understanding that we need to take those factors into consideration. So where we need to make sure that we're thoughtful is that whole process, right? So how do we understand what the business is trying to accomplish? How do we translate that into what a hypothesis or a set of like models might look like for testing? How do we communicate back to the business what the results are in a way they can understand it and take action on, right? So it's that sort of like feedback loop. I think that we're learning how to enable more effectively now than maybe we were in the past.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to understand a little bit about like the governance and kind of the phase gating of some of that, because I think it's a really interesting conversation, right? Especially as you get into the Gen AI. A lot of Gen AI POCs. We've seen them get to the end, and then it's like, well, is this ready for production? And the question is, well, how do we know it's ready for production? And that it's not always clear of like whether what success means for a POC. So like how do you set up appropriate governance while enabling innovation and kind of testing and learning while being good stewards of kind of the money of where to invest and where to place bets? Like that's got to be a pretty tough thing. Like how have you guys set that up?
It's interesting because it's one of those things that's more complicated now, I think, because of the hype associated with the change in the industry. If we look to, and I always look back to like the internet in 2000, 2001, and everybody talking about, the new economy and business 2.0. And a couple of years later, we realized, well, no, it's just the economy, right? Things just, the fundamentals don't change. The details may, and, perhaps we make step changes in terms of capabilities, but the underlying fundamentals are the same. And like I talked about earlier with data governance, right? There are certain core principles that you just need to have in place to be effective. And when things are new, it's hard to keep everybody within the boundaries of those principles and best behaviors, and we tend to make a lot of mistakes along the way as we're learning. But generally speaking, the best way to enable a new capability like that is what we always do, right? We need to have good governance structures in place, which means having the business at the table and educating them on what we expect of them. So not just saying, hey, business, you own the data, but you own the data and you need to be thinking about how it's being used, what data quality issues we have and how to manage them, who has access to the data, where it goes after it leaves your ownership, those sorts of things, right? It's like, how do you define all that stuff up front? And then on the technology side, it's helping our technologists understand their responsibilities as custodians of the data to manage it effectively, right? So how do we put the right lineage in place so that we understand the flow of the data through systems and how it's being sort of like evolving over time as it's being used? How do we put the proper audit controls in place to make sure that, we understand, data access and that we're managing data loss and things like that, right? It's having all those things in place. So it's just good, solid management principles. And like I said, sometimes it's hard to be well managed when things are as chaotic as they are right now. But I think we're seeing a trend toward that adoption of good process in this space.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I've had conversations with folks in the financial services space, it's a very familiar refrain about Gen AI. One, expectations are really high.
Yes.
And really high for pretty high ROI almost immediately. Honestly, I feel like that's come down a little bit, but the expectations initially were astronomical.
Yes.
Which was unfair and put too much pressure on it. I think the second thing a lot of those folks were hearing was, oh, I've got 50 vendors knocking on my door and I'm trying to figure out what the truth is. And then also, hey, I've got, the legal risk and compliance team is kind of handcuffed me. And then the last thing is, and oh, by the way, the team that audited our data said it's going to be a year before we have any of these use cases. So it is I want to, give you a lot of credit for like, hey, this moment in time versus I think, 6 months from now.
Yes.
I think things will have calmed a little bit.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word custodianship. I know you and I've talked to you about the term data stewardship. I think that's another thing that's tough to figure out. Who is accountable for the hygiene of the data, the definition of the data, making sure that data is kind of managed end to end, that it's correct. Like, how has that process been of getting more stewardship and ownership of the data versus like, hey, data team, you take care of everything for us? Like, how is that changing the relationship?
Yeah. Much like everything, it's a journey, right? I think that we, in the industry, I'll just say it this way, right? We're making good progress toward helping the business understand how they should be accountable, right? And where the responsibilities lie for the different things that you were talking about. And there are lots of different models for how you approach that, right? We talk about federated or centralized models, right? So depending on the type of organization you have, different models work better than others. But at the end of the day, in terms of the ownership of I'll call it the information, right? That the data sort of is the foundation of. The owner of the information is absolutely the business, right? They're the ones that create the data. They're the ones who use the data to manage the business. They're the ones who understand how it should be used downstream by their processes, right? So it's really critical for the business to understand their role in this whole process as really owners of the data. For technology, it's about making sure that we are providing the business with the infrastructure that they need to be able to perform that function, right?
Yeah.
So that we have good, solid data structures in place, that there is clear lineage, like I said, for the flow of the data through the system, and that the business has the ability to manage and to affect data quality.
Yeah. It's so hard though.
It is.
Just talk to a lot of organizations in different spaces, and this concept of stewardship is so foreign
Yes.
to a lot of times like the business, and because it's, they don't have data stewards on the team. They're kind of strategists, that type of thing. That you end up with a lot of people who it's a part-time job.
Sure.
I think also, technology and business and technology and product, even learning to speak a ubiquitous language and being able to do kind of domain modeling and like understanding each other is more important than ever, because it's become so much more complex. And then, I'd be curious your take here too. I find when people use the term data, they still think of data as anything that fits inside rows and columns on a spreadsheet, and very focused on structured data. How has the journey been on helping people see unstructured data as data and valuing that and knowing how to capture it and starting to build those, training data sets that you might need?
Yeah, I think that there's very low recognition of unstructured data and the value that exists there, right? And that is a tough conversation to have. Even in technology, sometimes it's hard for us to understand how to tap into that value. I think there's a recognition that there's a lot of it, there's gold in the hills, right? There's definitely value there, but how do we get at it? And then even with the tools that we have available to us, how do we use those tools to help the business then use that data once they have access to it? So I'd say we're still on that journey. That is one area I think where Gen AI actually has the potential to be a gigantic help, right? Because of its ability to do some interesting things with unstructured, right? Huge volumes of unstructured data. We haven't talked a lot about sort of the thing we have to manage there, which is the confidence level, right, of the output of generative AI. But regardless, I think that there's a lot of potential there to help the business extract value in data sources that they otherwise would not have, thought to even tap.
Yeah. That's one of the things that, when we're doing workshops, especially on Gen AI, that's like the first thing we do is help people see data. You have the data inside your walls. You have, data that your customers or your partners might have. You have data that your suppliers might have. There's open source types of data. And I think AI makes a lot more of that accessible than it's been in the past. This conversation, you and I probably wouldn't call this conversation data,
Right.
10 years ago.
Correct.
And depending on the quality of the conversation, some people still might not call it data. But this is data.
Yeah.
Our head of marketing is building a bot out of these conversations, using this as data. But most people don't think of a conversation or a Zoom meeting as data, and
That's
there's
right.
still so much data all around us. I've got a watch on that's measuring my heart rate, and so the data that we can sense, and there's still more data to be sensed. And so I think one of the key things for me is always helping people see, like, hey, is your problem that you haven't defined what the data is yet? Or is the problem that, we need to create net new data? Because I think that's one of the other things too. We talk a lot about capturing the counterfactual when it comes to data.
Right.
The example would be in investments, in investment management, right? No one captures all the data on the investments they don't make. But when you think about training a system on, like, hey, are we making the right investments?
Right.
You would want to know all the things you didn't do and how those turned out and see what your bias is. And so just like expanding the aperture of helping people see data. And because one of the big things I think for us is, this is, despite the hype cycle, it's still a marathon, not a sprint.
For sure.
And the people that are going to be the winners are the ones that are the best at training AI. I always like to equate AI to an intern. They're tireless. You got math whizzes, you got kind of really speed readers. They know nothing about your business. They've never had a job before. You have to manage them. You have to train them.
Yep.
They're not going to be coming in and just, you're going to put them, behind a teller desk and
That's
they're
right.
going to serve a customer. And so, that, I don't think I can overemphasize just the ability to kind of see the matrix and see data everywhere. And I don't know how it's going on getting the business to kind of like wrap their head around that, or if there's certain wins that you've been able to have, or any examples there.
Yeah. It's small wins, right? I mean, that's what we have to go for here, because, I think of this sort of as the Aldous Huxley problem, right? There's so much information. It's hard to know sort of where to start and where to focus, and what the ground truth even is founded upon, right? Much less getting to it. So and again, this is not maybe rocket science, right? It's picking the individual, like, little things that have enough value for people to see the benefit, but not large enough that it's going to take, let's say, a year to implement, or it's going to create a significant amount of risk that you don't know how to manage yet, right? You want to try to take baby steps, right? Find prototypes, proofs of concept, proofs of value, however you want to describe it, right? That allow you to demonstrate where the real benefits are, and then go from there. So with, like I was saying, with generative AI, one of the major benefits there is being able to take really large volumes of data and succinctly summarize. The challenge, like I alluded to before, is that, you do have to recognize, to your point, these are not perfect machines, right? And I think, if you watch TV in the 50s, they used to make, I can't think of a specific television show, but you would see like parodies of like UNIVAC, right? And people like, filing insurance claims, and like the computer making a mistake, and everybody was saying, well, the computer's perfect, it can't make mistakes, right? I think we're seeing similar things with AI today. People are like, well, it's a computer. It's why, how can it make mistakes? But in lots of ways, generative AI is even less, right, understandable than the old technology was back in the 50s. These models are so complex that understanding the decision flow is really, really hard. So they do make mistakes. You do have to have controls in place. We talk about putting human in the loop in these processes, not only for customer-facing applications, which is critical because you don't want an AI model making a decision for your customer without someone double-checking it, but even internally, having humans double checking, at least after the fact, to make sure the models are performing properly is really good.
You hit on a lot of things there I want to double click on. We've hit on risk, we've hit on compliance. A lot of those things are pretty binary.
Yes.
Usually, and mistakes, you don't hear as many people talking about fail fast and some of that stuff anymore, but mistakes generally not too acceptable.
That's
so
right.
How have you broached the topic of finding places where mistakes are okay, perfection is not the ultimate goal? Because a lot of times it's, hey, this is what is good enough or not good enough is over here. But then on the other side, being able to make mistakes, like, what if it saves you a lot of money? What if it makes you go a lot faster? how have you guys explored that space?
Yeah, I think we're still trying to figure, especially for generative AI, still trying to figure that out,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, we're still really, really early in that journey. I don't have a great answer other than, like I said before, pick use cases that are super low impact and ideally lower risk. But yeah, we're still trying to figure that out. So, obviously, and I think this is true of most organizations, looking at internal use cases is the right place to start, just because you can manage the risk much more effectively there, right? And you can put much more focus on human in the loop, person in the middle in the process to help sort of manage through that. And the nice thing about that is, to your point, you do learn along the way, right? So you can begin to develop an understanding of where these models or where these capabilities are truly effective versus maybe still not quite ready for prime time.
I'm curious because getting people to accept low impact use cases while still being able to invest, even if it's not going to be the big ROI that people were promised and hoped for in the hype cycle, like how, as you guys have been kind of looking at, like, hey, how much to invest in this space next year? I'd be curious, like, how has that conversation been? Because it sounds really hard of like, hey, this is a long game. We're going to have impact. It's going to be low impact, but we're still going to need to be able to invest. Like that's got to be pretty tough.
Sure. So I think that there's a broad recognition that regardless of all the challenges and issues, right, that this is absolutely a capability that we have to understand. It is certainly here to stay. We don't, maybe we don't know exactly how we're going to apply it and certainly not in every situation, but we have to invest, right? There's just no choice. Now, where that leads us, we don't necessarily know, but it's not that hard of a conversation. Some of it's mitigated by the fact that these technologies, you can actually do a fair amount of concept proving, right, without huge investment.
Yeah.
So we can pick a handful of use cases that are relatively low effort in terms of building out, proofs of concept and explore. So
we've found the same thing, but people are still always surprised of what you might be able to do in like 3 or 4 weeks with a SWAT team in this space. And I think that's, and I think maybe it's a hangover from the last, the big data days, if you will, like the last big buzzword, which I think kind of early 2010s time frame and the last kind of AI hype cycle. But those were expensive.
Yeah, they sure were.
It took a long time.
Yep. Hadoop's expensive. It can be. I mean, it's open source, but it's expensive to implement and manage, right? Yeah, you got to hire people who know how to do Hive and other, right? All these really complex things. With Gen AI, basically, let's say you're running in Azure, right? You just flip on the OpenAI in your tenant, right? And maybe you deploy LangChain and, a couple other minor tools, but they're all either open source or really low cost, and it's pretty easy to get going.
We're about to have a different conversation. We're going to go get my head of archecture. He's here.
Okay,
so,
great.
You're going
Sorry.
more. No. It's okay. There are a lot of engineers that listen to this, and now you have beaten the host. So we are successful there.
Fantastic.
I mean, is it fair to say then that, the year 2025 is a year of kind of getting our arms around and understanding kind of where the impact is? And then I'd be curious too, are you guys still waiting a little bit for a bit more maturity in the tool space for your industry?
We are absolutely. And again, I think the industry is we're on a conservative path, right? So most of us are not going to be leading the charge on deploying leading edge or bleeding edge capabilities just because it's not worth the residual risk that we would acquire by doing that.
We're seeing that a lot. A lot of people are saying like, yes, to your point, there's an inevitability of this technology, but it's not the risk compared to the cost of first mover advantage here isn't necessarily a thing.
We can talk about lots of examples where that's happened in the past 12 to 18 months, right? And it's clear that, and certainly, and that's the thing, right? The evolutionary cycles have really shortened now, where 18 months is almost a lifetime in Gen AI. So things have improved significantly, but there's still a fair amount of unknown associated with how these models work and what they're going to produce on any given prompt, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we're seeing that a lot of people saying like, hey, I'm going to wait for my platform providers to embed some of these capabilities into the technology I already have today because I'd rather rent it. I don't want to own it. That's kind of a sentiment I'm hearing right now.
That is certainly true, although then you run I won't say the risk, but you have the issue of understanding what the underlying model that they've deployed is.
And vendor lock-in.
People are certainly vendor lock-in. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, maybe that'll be the podcast title here of, the tension of AI,
Mm-hmm.
because that's kind of, it's all these kind of trade-off decisions.
That's
of
right.
Too big, too small, too fast, too slow,
That's
too
right.
big impact, too high
Yeah.
risk, too
Yeah.
low risk. And then going back to this concept of making mistakes, I think is so interesting, because I use the example of going to the doctor, right? And so, if I gave you an option of, you got to take your kids to the doctor, and you can either go to the doctor that's going to be right 95% of the time, or you can go ask an AI that's right 95% of the time. Like, you're probably going to prefer the human, I would guess, right?
Absolutely.
Well, it's like, and with AI, what if I said AI was right 96% of the time, and the human is right 95% of the time? Like, do you still prefer the human because it's got that touch? Like,
I would say both, right?
Right.
Give me both.
And that's the tough thing, right? But now if I say, the doctor's $100 and you got to wait 3 weeks, and the AI is available now, and you got to wait 3 minutes, and it's $5.
Yep.
Like, that's, I use that because that's the equation,
Right.
that people are debating, and why it's so hard, because we're so used to this kind
Right.
of chain of human liability,
Yep.
and having you mentioned the humans in the loop
Yep.
there. So
Yep.
I don't know if you guys have similar examples where you've been able to kind of like line up like some of these trade-off decisions. It sounds like we're still playing around.
Yeah, we're
with
still
it.
playing around with it. And I would say to that point, right, I mean, it is fundamentally an economic discussion, right? And sometimes it's hard to quantify, but certainly qualitatively, there's an economy or an economic balance to all this. And
Yeah.
And your example is a great one, right? In the medical field, because there are significant, I think, opportunities to leverage AI and other technologies to make the outcomes better, right? But how do you do that? How do you enable it? Right? Is the challenge.
Yeah. Do you feel like the policy side, whether it's, your guys' own policy or even just like the regulatory compliance policy, do you feel like things are going the right direction to be friendly enough to accept this kind of different way of work, where like, yes, we can sacrifice perfection, but we can potentially serve more, and we can serve faster? Like, is that conversation starting yet?
It is starting, and honestly, and this is back to where I think tension really is a very good thing. I think the conversations are happening in a very rational way, right? So the balance of wanting to move quickly and realize benefits versus not taking on too much risk and really exposing, ourselves. I think those conversations again across the industry are happening.
Yeah.
Maybe because of the hype.
Yeah. I'm curious. We talked about responsible AI, and I think one thing, people have over predicted many times the demise of the branch, demise of the human touch in banking, and we're seeing people still really value that
Yes.
relationship when it comes to their money. It's complex, especially as you get into business banking, commercial banking, like the importance
for
there.
sure.
I'm curious, like the sentiment of the employees, whether they be on the front lines or kind of back office, like, are people asking for it? Are they excited about it? Are you seeing kind of fear of what this might mean for my job? Like, what do you like? Whether it's your industry or others in banking,
understood.
How are you seeing
Yeah,
that?
yep. In general, I'd say that it's a mix. I'd say that from a sort of a general perception standpoint, there's a fair amount of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about what Gen AI means, right? To just employment in general. People
Yeah.
are nervous. But if you get into specific use cases like call center space, I think there's actually a desire, right? If the tools can help a call center rep be more effective, I've seen very much acceptance and interest in that, right? Anything to help make the job more straightforward, more beneficial to the interaction with the customer. There's not a whole lot of resistance to it, but they don't necessarily look at it through the broader lens of what does this mean, like
Right.
long-term to productivity and things like that. So I think they're kind of viewed separately to a degree.
And kind of past, I guess, the interest phase, or awareness, if we're living in an ad car world for a moment, like, what else have you guys seen in terms of? I know a lot of still POCs, but as you think about change management and driving adoption, no matter who it is, of these models, whether it's your customers or your frontline or your back office folks, like, how are you guys starting to think about just like the amount of change that'll need to be driven
I mean,
here
it's
to drive adoption?
it's absolutely huge. I'd say that we're pretty good at change overall, and some of that's motivated by just the change we've gone through, and that you mentioned in the beginning, last couple of years with the merger, right? So there's an underlying sort of ability to adapt to changes in general that we're that we're leveraging. But the unknown is the thing that's always the hardest to deal with, right? And that's why I go back to smaller steps, right? Trying to, just manage things incrementally so that we're not taking on too much all at once. That tends to be our focus, our approach.
Yeah. So I guess as you kind of look forward to 2025, there's a lot on your plate. We know that. But I guess, what would you say, what are you most excited about? What's your hope for kind of where things are a year from now, maybe?
Yep. So I think if I had to guess, just looking at the way things are headed, I think within the next, let's say 12 months, we'll have a much better handle on exactly where the current instantiation of generative AI is effective. Like, what are the true use cases where it makes sense to deploy large language models in business, right? What is it really good at? What is it not really good at? And hopefully some of the noise around that will decrease a bit, and that'll help us really focus on where to prioritize and how to focus. On the flip side, I think we'll see a whole new almost species of AI models coming. If you look at some of the research that's going on right now, and in fact, I think Jeffrey Hinton said this maybe a few months ago, that if you want to be on the leading edge of AI research today, it's not in large language models. We've kind of, I wouldn't say we're at the end of the evolution for LLMs in terms of what they're capable of, but if you look at sort of the curve, if you will, right, the maturity curve, we're definitely hitting a plateau, which is great, right? I mean, back to my point, that means we'll be able to figure out what they can do for real and how to use them effectively. But the next evolution of AI is going to be something probably fairly different. LLMs may play a role in that, but there's going to be something, pretty phenomenal to take us to the next level, to get us beyond what I would call still pretty narrowly focused AI capabilities that we have today, which is laughable because 5 years ago, you wouldn't consider this narrow at all, right? This would be like mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, I think too, maybe I'll have you quickly define when you say the word narrow.
Oh, sure.
Just for people, because you're not saying limited, but I think you're differentiating narrow versus general
it's a great
intelligence there.
conversation. And I'm tempted to go into the history of AI, but I won't, because that would take too long. But what I'll say is that, before 2017, if you ask someone, how would you demonstrate that we've built artificial intelligence? They would say the Turing test, right? If you could put an AI in front of someone in a black box and have them have a conversation for some period of time, and they were convinced it was a human, then you've got artificial intelligence. By today's definition, that's not even close, right? Because we can do that today, but no, I don't know that anyone would consider OpenAI or ChatGPT or any of the tools to be truly intelligent in the human sense, right? Human level intelligent.
Yeah.
Right.
And to your point around being too open with models, I think people have figured out how to beat the Turing test in the past, but then, the AI model walks off stage.
It just blows it out of the water. It doesn't even exist as a thing anymore, right? So we refer to that as narrow intelligence, narrow in the sense that it can do one or two things or maybe a handful of things really well. Like large language models can produce text really well. Generative models can produce images really well, right? But you wouldn't have necessarily an image model write a poem, right? They're good at doing one thing really well or maybe a couple of things really well. The move to general intelligence, where you begin to have AI that is like human level capable, of driving a car and writing a book at the same time, right? That level of intelligence is beyond what we think we can do with LLMs today.
And I think it's an important point too, because I think sometimes when people see these capabilities, it's easy to confuse the modality with the model.
That's right.
And really, when you're interacting with one of these models, you're dealing with an orchestrator, who is handing a job to models built on models that each do one thing that present back as aspects of intelligence,
and they are not thinking, right? And that's the hard thing to explain, because it feels like they are, right? When you ask it a really complex question, you get a great answer back. It's like, that's amazing, but really all it's doing is predicting a series of tokens based on the prompt that you entered, right? And it just happens to be really good, right, at predicting what a good answer would be.
Yeah, it's nuanced, but I think that's one of the most important things, just because, especially as, people are wrestling with use cases. I think it's one of the hard things that, Gen AI was first a consumer use case and then became a business use case, because people confuse Gen AI with ChatGPT.
Yes.
And kind of confusing what an LLM is with the modality of a chat-based interface.
Yep.
And the nice thing is now I'm seeing more people have LLM use cases that don't have a chat bot on top of it, but it took us a minute to get there.
That's
And,
right.
You know, the statistic I've always loved to share is, you know, I think Siri is on 500 million devices in the world, and 98% of the population has never used Siri in a business use case. So I think there's also like some technologies take a little bit longer to cross the consumer to business divide, to your point around where's the actual impact versus, you know, something like the iPhone, right? Where, you know, the CEOs see their kids walking around with better devices in their hands than they do, and all of a sudden we have BYOD immediately.
That's right.
And they're like, I'm done with this BlackBerry.
That's right.
And I think a big difference here of, you know, there was a pretty significant first mover advantage for mobile banking. And just, you know, if we're kind of comparing trends and like paradigm shifts, that's probably the last big one in our space.
Yep.
And not there haven't been a lot of other ones in the meantime. But I think it's a good kind of foil to, you know, that was a massive leap forward and completely changed how people interact with their banks today.
Absolutely.
Versus, you know, Gen AI and AI are kind of these embedded technologies, but we're probably not going to be just banking with a chatbot. And giving up our UI anytime soon.
That's right. Probably not, at least not in total, right? There may be certain use cases where that's true, but yeah, you're right. I think this is more of a, how do I describe it? It's more of it's something we won't even notice in a couple of years. We won't even think about we'll be talking about other AI stuff in a couple of years, but this will become so commonplace and so everyday that it won't even register.
Yeah, I mean, I've used that example in like the business intelligence space, for example. You know, we have all these Tableau or Power BI or Domo, and you know, I like to kind of show a graph that shows descriptive versus diagnostic versus, you know, predictive versus prescriptive. And, you know, to do some of those things, sometimes you need ML.
Right.
Sometimes it's math.
Right.
But the line between advanced analytics and analytics is extremely blurry.
It is.
And, you know, doing descriptive analytics on an image is an extremely heavy ML use case, but doing it on, you know, a spreadsheet is not.
That's
It's something that, you know, we've been doing for a long time.
That's
and
right.
So I agree. I think, you know, there will be times where it's hard to tell the difference between a chatbot versus an agent Gen AI model versus a live person on some of those use cases. I think even now people are trying to figure out, okay, what's an agent and what's a bot? And like, how are they related and what's the difference there versus, and so I think to your point, you know, a lot of these things, especially as they become embedded in what we already use, will become something that's kind of a natural.
I think much like light bulbs, right? Do you care whether it's incandescent or LED? I mean, maybe environmentally you do, but in principle, you flip the switch and the light's on, right? It's going to be that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, any other kind of thoughts? Anything we didn't hit? I think we
covered the gamut, right?
Are you ready to give us a sign off here?
Probably not today.
Okay. Well,
sorry.
Well, we tried. You know, since we're building a bot on this, and since we're talking about data, your DJ history is now
it's immortalized.
It's now a data point.
That's wonderful.
That probably wasn't a fully owned data point.
I don't think I'd expose that very broadly. Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, somewhere if someone has a conversation with our bot and asks which podcast guests, you know,
more radio DJs,
it'll become a deep piece of trivia.
Fantastic.
For the bot in the future.
That's lovely.
Awesome, Joe. Well, this was really fun. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
We'll schedule you 1 year from now.
Okay.
And we're going to check up on your hypotheses.
Let's do
the follow-up.
That'd be exciting.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, take care.
Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.